Are we on? I don't think yet.
Yeah, streaming live on YouTube. Yeah.
Is it? I don't see
Yeah.
it. But
Live on YouTube.
hello,
Yeah.
everyone. This is Lada from Astro.com, and today I am here for a special edition with my friend and colleague Donny from Singapore, an incredible astrologer who is doing a Halloween special for us on a very grim topic, the astrology of endings and accidents. Hello, Donny.
Happy Halloween. Is
Wow,
this
what
Sunday? Yeah.
you chose for us.
I know. Actually, I wanted to present this like months earlier, but the timing was just not right.
Scorpius is
So,
the perfect time to talk about death and accidents. So.
well, when I say endings, there can be many versions. I've got one which is literally that person did pass, is a celebrity. And I've got another one which is an accident of a celebrity. So we look at that. What are the Astro-Signatures? And then I've actually got a very long time client who kindly sent me the timing of when he actually sent an email to HR to say that he quit. So he ended his job. We shall look at that. It's a very interesting chart. And then
Okay, so it's not just death. It's not just death.
no, like I want to expand the meanings because we can end a lot of things in our lives, right? I mean, life is all about cycles of endings and beginnings, and it doesn't necessarily have to be mortality wise, we leave our physical body, but we also can end our job as well, and our career, in which this person did. And I've got the exact time whereby he also did his clearance and stepped out of the company. Another very interesting chart as well. Because at that moment when he stepped out of the company after he did his clearance, he's done with the job. He's a free man. So there's like an ending as well to start something new. And then what is the last example? The last one is a more grim one because we're going to look at the guy who actually shot Versace, the fashion designer. And I'm going to include his astrocartography map or ACG map, or what we call in astrology relocation, because I find some very interesting tidbits that it's just uncanny. It's almost like there's this karmic connection between him and Versace, because Versace is his last victim. And there's a lot of things going on between them. So I find it very interesting. So I shall just go on to share my screen. Let me just... Yep, so do you see my presentation?
Perfect.
Yeah, so I've named this presentation Astro-Signatures of Endings and Accidents because I explained earlier, endings is not just endings as in our mortality. I actually put in the picture in my background and also on the first page, a picture of Venus and Pluto side by side, because somehow Venus is also in the picture when I look at ending charts. And it played out for me exactly when I lost my grandmother as well. Venus was very prominently featured in my chart. So I just want to mention that Venus, as we all know, not only represent love, material comforts, plus all things sugar and spice, but it also marks like the transitionary phases of death and rebirth as well within our lives. And this is very much symbolized perfectly by the esoteric rulership of Venus over the sign of Gemini when we talk about esoteric astrology. And Gemini, as we know, is ruled by Mercury. And this really is linked to the concept of the psychopomp or the gate tender, which can actually help people shift from one state to another. So there's that. And I must first and foremost clarify my inspirations behind this presentation, because first and foremost, it is Halloween season. So just like a very brief go through like what is Halloween all about. It's actually linked back to the pagan Gaelic festival of Samhain. I wonder if I butchered that word. But then it also marks a very pivotal time when seasons change. Observers also believe that around the Scorpio season where Halloween is based off from, the boundary between the world and the next one adjacent to us, it's almost like the veil becomes especially thin. So it enables people to connect with the dead. And very much Scorpio season in terms of meaning. And this belief is actually shared with some other cultures as well. And this is also mentioned in the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. And this Jewish holiday also occurs in October as well. And for them is a holiday where they say prayers for the dead. And that's how actually Halloween gains its connection with its haunted roots, so to speak. Yeah. The second point I've put here is that there's still a transit Saturn-Uranus closing square this whole year. I think the last exact one, we're going to experience it on Christmas Eve, 2021. But then the eclipses next year in 2022 will highlight either Uranus, Saturn, or even both. They are still like within that range of a waning square. So when I think about Saturn Uranus, I've actually got this whole year to think about it, what it's actually about. As we actually dismantle our existing life structures and break out of like old programming and restrictions, things are just busted and it's not really worth for us to hang on anymore. And we have to pivot ourselves into a new direction. And this influence can actually cause a lot of grief of what was, because we're moving into the future of the unknown, what will be. And this can bring not only grief, but also despondency. You may go through like a stage of depression as well. I think as we move through this cycle. And so I've mentioned before, I've included a real life client's example of when he decided to end his job. So that'll be interesting. It's a two-part example. And the last one will be that we are entering or soon to enter the period where Venus goes retrograde in Capricorn, and she will kiss Pluto 3 times. So this is almost to me like Ishtar. This is almost like Ishtar or Inanna's like journey into the underworld, which is Plutonian or Hades. And this also reminds me of the story of Persephone as well, as she has to like take off her clothes and all her prized possessions and just go deep, like being in a state of like, I would call it naked and sacred, because you feel super vulnerable in that sense. And since it's happening in Capricorn, it's going to be really hard, serious lessons we have to know. We have to absorb in ourselves, confront a lot of things that's really uncomfortable. Capricorn is what we have known to be working for us. But, you know, when Venus kissed Pluto 3 times there in Capricorn, it's going to be leaving some things behind as well. So this presentation actually aims to provide a broader and wider concept or perspective of on the topic of endings. And this can be, what I mentioned earlier, it may not be physical, it may be metaphorical. And I also want to, or I at least hope to demystify or de-taboo this essential phase of life that is within the totality of our human experience and evolutionary process as well. Because, you know, as we know, once we are born, the time is ticking till we die. So it's, you know, there's a finiteness into that. I've also included an example that talks about accidents in which the person didn't pass but did go through like quite a gnarly accident as well as an example. So let's go on to like the basics of the things that I observed when I look at such charts. And the first thing that really came up to me are the houses. So the houses, I will usually attribute it to the water houses. That means houses 4th, 8th, and 12th, because these houses as a group is known as the houses of endings. So 4th house is like endings and beginnings. That's one of the main meanings. 8th house is the house of death and rebirth, transformation, or something that's irrevocable changes, something that's permanent. Once you make that change, it's going to stick with you forever. And 12th house is really like the house of losses. I just want to mention here that 12th house, the sign of Pisces, and the modern ruler, which is Neptune. This really talks about where we see the divine or God. It also talks about things that overwhelm us and outside our span of control. It also celebrates being at one. That means that merging effect or in unity with consciousness and the desire to merge and reconnect with source since we left the womb's comfort and environment as well. Because the 12th house, there's another meaning to it, is the 2 hours prior that we enter the earth plane. So that's how the meanings come about.
Do you use cosine house system or do you use Placidus?
For the examples, I use Placidus.
Okay.
I use Placidus, but you can toggle back and forth with whole sign and Placidus to see what works for you, because I actually use both. When I use whole sign house system, it's a more holistic because it's sign-based house system. So it gives like a holistic overview of things. And I usually use whole sign house more when I do a natal chart reading, actually. So on top of that, I gotta talk about houses, the 7th house and also the 2nd house as well. Because the 7th house is really where the sun's rays go to die each day, as day actually officially transitions into night, diurnally. And the descendant or the 7th house cusp is also known as the portal of death. So 7th house usually comes up a lot as well. And the 2nd house is because it's 8 houses away from the 7th. So it's the death from the sun's rays being extinguished. And if we go by the natural wheel of the zodiac, the 2nd house is the natural domain of Taurus, and the 7th house is the natural domain of the sign Libra. And these are both Venus root signs.
Yeah, it's interesting because in Vedic astrology, the houses of death are the 2nd and the 7th, exactly, yeah. Venus root ones.
So
maybe we actually finally get to feel happy when we die.
Well, because when I think about the gilf or the symbol of Venus is really that circle and that cross below. The circle represents that unity with the cosmic forces. And the cross is really the cross of matter. And so when you merge the two, it's almost like, oh, okay, maybe, well, I think maybe sometimes when we need to merge with cosmic forces, we can't be in a physical body, can we? That's why
spirit over matter, yeah.
That's why Venus actually exalts in Pisces, which is the sign which I talked about is linked to Neptune and the 12th house as well. So I've actually put here the Venus yacht, in which is included in my presentation as my launch last year. I think it was in August. And I've actually pulled out that picture to nicely summarize what I'm talking about, because the Venus yacht actually highlights houses 2nd, 7th, and 12th here. So it's very much that I just explained. So let's move on to the aspects. When I actually look at a natal chart, when I say natal chart, this can be a natal chart of someone's birth chart. It can be a wedding engagement chart if we are looking at a divorce chart, maybe because it's the ending of a marriage, or it can be a natal chart of starting a new job that we are looking at. And there's usually, when I look at a natal chart and the ending or death chart or accident chart whatsoever, I usually spot 3 things, which are conjunction, oppositions, and squares. These are the ones that really bring things into manifestation for me. At least that's what I saw. And let's now talk about the planets or points in the chart that I usually look at. So let's start with the nodal axis. Because the nodal axis, if I think about it, it represents the energetic point where the soul enters or leaves the material plane. So anything that's like contacts between nodal axis of one to the other, between the 2 charts, will tell me something regarding that. And Chiron, which is the asteroid of wounding, pain, hurts, and suffering, is definitely another feature of that. And now let's move on
Chiron in the transits makes hard aspects to what? To the
like you just for example, if I've actually seen transit Chiron squaring the sun can bring about some kind of sickness. It can also bring in some kinds of accidents, since now Chiron is transiting Aries, which is a Mars root sign. And this can bring some kind of accidents into a person's life. I've actually seen that happen.
And so be more careful now.
Yeah, because not to mention that next year we've got a Mars retrograde in Gemini, which is a very movable sign. So, and Gemini rules the roads. So I wonder if it's and that Mars in Gemini that's retrograde for the bulk of the end of 2022 into early 2023 rules that Chiron in Aries.
December and January is retrograde.
Yeah, I think it starts going retrograde 1 year from now exactly. I think it's it stations retrograde on Halloween, close to. So let's now let's now look at the 2 social planets, which are Jupiter and Saturn, because Jupiter is the natural ruler of the 9th house. And 9th house is where we go to be in heaven and also travel to God, to have a word with God. Mm-hmm. And so it has that esoteric meaning, which is sometimes I've seen it in endings and accident charts. And then when we talk about malefic Saturn, this really is about that blockage, or when we talk about malefic planets, it's usually tied into the removal of something from our lives. Something has served its purpose. So this can be linked to death charts. And this can be for relationships, employment, or even spiritual death, but it also can mean like physical death as well.
So would you say like hard aspects, for example, from transiting Saturn and Jupiter to natal planets? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, I'm going to talk about
like Saturn in the 12th, Saturn transiting the 8th, Saturn transiting the 4th.
The 4th. I've even seen Saturn transit the 9th as well, 7th and 2nd. So there's a lot of potentials of
all the time.
But usually there's multiple indicators. Like it needs to add up, and we will see that like with the 4.5 examples I'm going to show the audience here. And then we move on. Oh, before that, I'll like to touch on, because in traditional astrology, Saturn is the last visible planet in the sky. So it signifies like that final frontier.
Exactly. That's why it rules
Yeah.
death and things as well.
Yeah, so it's before we break through from the material into something else. So Saturn is definitely included in some way, shape, or form into endings and accident charts. And now let's move on to the modern planets. So let's start with Uranus. And Uranus is really that abrupt, out of the blue, that that sudden reversals and disruptions that we experience in life. That's very it just catches all of us by surprise, really. And Uranus usually is very much highlighted in accident charts as well. So let's move on to Neptune. And I've mentioned Neptune is really merging with that. It's the energy of oneness as we merge the soul with God to transcend into oneness. So it's about the dissolution of something. And in some cases, this can be our physical bodies. And Pluto, which co-rules Scorpio, and is the natural domain of the 8th house of death, rebirth, transformation, permanent or irrevocable changes, and it also represents the underworld as well.
Oh, such big changes with Pluto.
Yeah.
With Pluto, it's heavy energy. It's like
I've recently heard of this person that told me that said something like Pluto transits doesn't necessarily kill you.
No. They kill people around you.
But it does burst your bubble. It's almost like the experience of you as a child knowing that Santa Claus isn't real. You feel that cheated, which is Pluto. You feel that disappointment, you feel that anger, but then you still carry on celebrating Christmas. You know what I mean? You just move along.
So true, yeah.
That can be like a nice way to kind of explain like the plutonic transits in the sky. But of course, if it's in combination with other planets, then Pluto added into the mix can really represent something that's, final in a way. So when we talk about hard contacts between a natal chart and a endings and accidents chart, involving the nodes, social planets, and outer planets, so from Jupiter to Pluto outwards, and also Chiron, this will actually paint the undertones, the background, and the macro picture of circumstances or situations surrounding the event. I've written here, this can be like divorce, losing a job, accident, or even physical death for that matter. But what actually constitutes the actual event materializing? I actually look at the concurrent triggers of what the transit Sun, Mars, Moon is doing to the natal chart, so to speak. Mercury and Venus in the transit chart in the event of the event comes into place whereby there's somewhat linkages to transportation and also vehicles involved. Especially Mercury, there's almost like a communication in terms of a letter, a note, or an email. And Venus, as we know, is brought about by a relationship of sorts with another person. So before I actually go into the examples, if you want to look back on this video and have a DIY for yourself, you may want to take a piece of paper and just draw a line in between to split things into two columns. One column, you can label it as macro circumstances or undertones of the event. And on the other side, you can label it as transit triggers from Sun to Mars in order for that event to manifest into a concrete event or occurrence. So you need to generate two charts. One is the natal chart with a reliable time. This can be someone's birth chart, an elected chart for a wedding or engagement or starting a new job, etc. Because we'll be using mostly that chart with a reliable time to look into the house rulerships in the process. And then the second chart you're going to generate is the transit chart for the event in question. This can be an accident, this can be an ending, etc., etc. And if you have a reliable time for the event of the accident or physical death whatsoever, even better. Because houses in both charts can now be compared for more in-depth accuracy. Okay, so let's look at the first example. Okay, let's look at this celebrity, Naya Rivera. On the left, I've managed to get her natal chart with a reliable birth time. And on the right side is her death chart. It's set for the day that she passed, unfortunately. And there's no time written in the news. So the angles of the death chart on the right is set for the noon time of that day. So ignore the angles of the right side of the chart. And then let's do a bi-wheel. So let's put the natal chart in the center, and then on the outer, which is a transit chart of her day of death, on the outer wheel. Mm-hmm. And so I've got this chart. Okay.
On the sun.
So as I mentioned earlier, the natal chart is in the inner wheel, and the death chart or the transit chart of the event is on the outer wheel. So now let's go to look at the macro circumstantial indicators. What's actually for that day, how the transits are actually interacting with her natal chart to bring about plausible manifestation of the event that actually happened. So the macro circumstance indicators here, so we're looking at the nodes, the social to the outer planet, so from Jupiter to Pluto, and then we'll also look at Chiron as well. So this is what this section is about, and for the rest of the presentation actually. And then for the second part, we'll look at, are there anything in the transit Sun to Mars chart that really bring this plausible event into concrete occurrence? That's the second part. And okay, so now let's look at the macro circumstantial indicators here. The major one that I spotted right off the bat is transit Neptune. That's conjunct her natal's 7th house ruler, which is Jupiter in Pisces. So as we mentioned earlier, the 7th house is also a house to consider when we look at ending charts, because this is where the sun's rays actually die. And since we've got the planet Neptune by transit is activating her Jupiter, she did die of drowning, by the way.
Oh, Neptune.
Yeah. And we are very mysterious.
She has Neptune in the 8th house as well. So
yes. And so that's another indication, because 8th house is also one of the houses of endings, along with houses 4th and 8th as well. So the next part will be transit Uranus. And transit Uranus is in her natal 12th house over here in the red circle, and is opposing her natal Neptune in her natal 6th house. So this can be really sudden and out of the blue, for that matter. So now let's move on to that transit Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. that's going on in the sky when she passed, and is highlighted in the green circles over here. And these two are actually conjunct in her natal 8th house. So there's multiple indicators here. Very interesting.
Three transits in her 8th house: Saturn, Pluto, Jupiter. Are they on top of the sun? Pluto and Jupiter?
Oh, yes.
Wow.
It's actually Sun and Mercury in this case, because Mercury rules her first house cusp of Gemini. So first house is the physical body, and the Sun actually rules her 4th house of endings and beginnings.
Yeah.
So, so this actually represents, when I see Jupiter and Pluto together, is freeing of the soul from the physical body via a death or transformation of sorts. And so we can see how all these things stacks up. There's usually more than just one or two planets doing its thing. It's usually like there's actually 5 whole points here. And each one carries like quite loaded weight, I would say. And so let's look at the transit north node. And the transit north node in the outer wheel is conjunct her natal moon, which rules her 2nd house, 8 houses away from the 7th. So the sun's rays die from that transition from day to night. And we all know that Rahu, or the north node, has got a Jupiterian feel to it, which is to be released, to have a word with God. You know, it's that liberation effect as well. And so this adds on to that energy of, oh, maybe she will leave her physical body, like literally speaking. And last but not least, let's look at Chiron over here. And Chiron is in the outer bi-wheel. It is conjunct her 12th house ruler, Mars. Because Mars in her natal chart rules the 12th house Aries. So another kind of loss of physical vitality, because we're talking about Mars. So you can see how all this adds up, like is stacked on top of each other. When we look at transit nodes to her natal, transit Chiron to her natal, and transit social and outer planets to her natal, which is Jupiter to Pluto. But this does not mean that it will manifest into something concrete, into an event that will actually take place. We got to look at transit Sun to Mars. Is it doing anything to her natal chart on the day? So let me just, okay, let's not confuse the audience. Let's move on to this part. And on that day, we have a transit Mercury and Mars square that forms a T-square with her natal Neptune that's located in her 8th house. And true enough, it accurately described what actually happened, because she was on a boat and then she drowned. And that Mercury is that transport vehicle that we talked about earlier. And Neptune here really talks about a water medium-based vehicle, which is a boat.
It's funny, she has Neptune and Mercury already in the 8th house of death.
Yeah.
So.
And let me see. Mercury is... Oh, let's look at transit Sun. This is also very interesting. Transit Sun is applying that day to oppose her Sun and Mercury as well. In her natal 8th house, which rules in her natal chart the 1st and 4th. So yeah. There's just transits stacked upon transits upon transits upon transits. So it's like this kind of, you can just tabulate it into an Excel spreadsheet and just see for yourself. It's just too many things that indicate that something is about to happen to her that's that may remove her from this earth plane. Yeah. Also, if you want to, for those who are very scorpionic, for those audiences who are very scorpionic, you may want to use the method I actually mentioned and analyze the chart of Mary Wilson, which she's part of the Supremes. And she actually passed in 2021 as well. You will see that at the end, there's a very strong natal 2nd, 7th, and 10th house activations between her birth chart and also the day that she passed. There's this very strong linkage between the houses I mentioned, between those charts. Let's look at something that's less grim for a change. Let's look at an accident chart, which is Tiger Woods in this case. And on the left, it's his natal chart with a reliable birth time. And on the right, I've actually used the date of the accident. There's no mentioning of the exact time, so I've used the approximate time for this accident transit chart. And so now let's look at how this accident transit chart, what actually was activated within his natal chart from the accident transit chart. Okay, so in this case, let's look at the macro circumstantial indicators with the inner wheel as being his natal chart, and then the outer wheel is the accident transit chart. The first thing that really jumped out at me is the transit north node, because the transit north node conjunct his natal 8th house ruler, Mars, and also the 3rd house ruler. And we are talking about a car accident, so very much like a 3rd house topic. And then the 8th house really brings in the danger.
And of course, Mars is again.
Yes. And Mars is in Gemini.
Yes, yeah, in a degree of accident, 17 degrees of Gemini. No, 15 degrees.
18 would be the correct one, but it is retrograde in his chart, so it's involved in the 18 degree as well.
Okay.
Yeah, because his natal Mars is retrograde, so the degree that it came from, which is the 18th degree, you can also consider that as well. So that's already like a danger point. Now let's look at transit Pluto. And transit Pluto actually conjunct his 1st and 10th house natal lord, which is Mercury.
Oh, yes.
Over here.
Yeah, within less than a degree, 30.
Less than a degree, yes. And so that's another indicator.
Transformation, death, rebirth, yeah.
And then the next part, I actually use a thing called midpoints. A midpoint is actually defined as the shorter distance of 2 bodies in the chart. So I'm looking in specific the transit midpoint of Mars and Pluto. And Mars by transit is at 25 of Taurus, and Pluto is at 25 of Capricorn. So the midpoint is around 25 degrees of Pisces, which is the middle distance between these 2 planets in the transit chart, and is very closely conjunct with around 1 degree orb to his 7th house cusp.
So Mars, Pluto midpoint would be connected to accidents, dangerous accidents.
Mars and Pluto co-rule Scorpio, so it also can mean be seriously hurt or even death for that matter.
A few weeks ago when my grandma passed, and you wrote to me and you said, Lada, the midpoint of Saturn and Pluto transit is right on your ascendant.
Yeah.
And Saturn is elderly people, grandparents. Pluto is death. And he says, like, I had a lot of early Aquarius rising, like I am. You told me where the Saturn Pluto midpoint is been those few months that are going through really tough situations right now. And that's when I started paying attention to midpoints. So thanks for bringing this up to me.
Oh, by the
And by
way,
the way, just to know, Don is making an answer to one question, which is discounted. It's a promotion just for the next, I don't know, 1 or 2 weeks. I'm not sure. So
yeah,
you
it's
can
just
put
a short promo. Yeah, because I don't want to get a whole bunch of like, when will I die kind of questions. So.
to do this for next spring.
You
About
know,
endings and, when will
yeah.
I quit my job or
Well, there's a lot of, considerations and those questions will be harder to do actually. Like when will it happen? Because there's so many stuff that you need to take into consideration. But then, I mean, for all the examples, there's already a transit accident or death chart to work with. So everything is like, you can see how it brings in all those things I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, which are like what to look at and from what perspective each.
I want to say something. I think no one has a right, as an astrologer, to tell to anyone, even if they think when they'll die or when there is danger of them dying. I think only God knows this thing.
I
I'm
mean,
sure
honestly,
you
we both.
can see when someone is in more danger, but you warn them to be more careful. You don't tell them you're gonna die
I
or
mean,
you.
honestly, all of us will have like multiple portals in our lives to potentially cross over, or transition for that matter. I prefer to use that word. And but
Like cancer
then
lives.
yeah, but then you need also a second component, which is like transit Sun to Mars to actually bring that into manifestation as well. So there's two parts to this equation, which can be very time consuming to do as well. So
Yeah.
please, like, if you want to ask me a question, ask something that's like, something
Not
that's a,
not when will I die. Just don't ask this question.
well, yeah, I mean, like after a while, it just kind of sucks the life out of me. So what for, right? And let's move on to how about that transit Saturn Uranus square in the sky at the point of his accident? Because at that point, transit Uranus in the sky is opposing his natal Uranus. So he's going through like a midlife classical transit. I'm also going through that. So you guys know how old I am. The filter really helps. And so transit Saturn and Uranus square is forming like a T square.
Uh-huh.
And the apex of the T square is Saturn in
Oh.
Aquarius. And so this really tells you that with Saturn and Uranus energy is something chaotic, Uranus. And the apex is Saturn, which rules bone. Your bones, which is Saturn. And in Aquarius to fracture.
Mm-hmm.
And that Saturn actually co-ruled that Uranus. So bone fracture is very prominent here. I find that very interesting. And last but not least, transit Chiron is in his natal 7th house and is square his natal 12th house lord, which is the sun. So it's highlighted in green over here.
Mm-hmm.
So his natal 12th house is activated by transit Chiron in his 7th. So 7th and 12th house, yeah, like.
Oh, Donny, now you've added another planet to my list to worry about, Chiron. I never and now it's gonna pass through all my planets.
No, but then it's just like you need to stack, like you can just on the Excel spreadsheet, you just need to stack all those things up. It needs to be that way. It's just not one off, like Chiron will do this to you. You can see how like I've picked up 5 using
yeah.
whatever I've mentioned earlier. And for him, it just stacks up. And so there's really like a very strong macro picture that's being painted here. And then now let's move on to triggers from transit Sun and Mars. And what I find really interesting is that transit Venus is in morning star phase. And when Venus by transit is in the morning star phase in the sky, it usually talks about the physicality or the mechanical parts of life. It's very Taurian-like when it's in morning star phase. And transit Venus is in square to his natal second house lord and also ninth house lord, Venus. That's located in Scorpio in the third house. So third house, as we know, is transport, driving. Venus is there in the sign of Scorpio.
Mm-hmm.
And Venus rules the second house, which is 8 houses away from the 7th. So there's a danger of his sun's rays dying out, so to speak. And 9th house is to really potentially see God. So when you put all these things together, yeah, it can mean that. And transit moon is also separating from a square with his natal 7th house lord, Jupiter. So moon is here and is separating in a square with Jupiter. And
yeah, but it's definitely lighter transits than the previous chart you showed us.
Yeah, and then Jupiter is actually ruled by Mars in the 9th, which is activated by transit north node. So you can see how, well, I mean, I've typed everything out here so people can go back to refer it. But what I find really interesting is the last point. Because transit Mercury is activating the transit Saturn Jupiter midpoint in the sky. At the point of this accident. And this relationship or connection is square to his 7th house lord, Neptune. And Neptune, one of the meanings is that there's a lapse in judgment to cause the accident to happen. And then he did break his bones, in this case, ankles, which is ruled by the sign of Aquarius, in which he did break his ankles from the accident. So it's very uncanny how all this plays out, and the symbolic meanings of the astrology really like jumps out at me.
In Vedic astrology, accidents is the 6th house, and there he has Aquarius, so indeed he has the biggest chance of accidents connected to the
Aquarian part of his body, which is the ankles.
Mm-hmm.
So it literally happened that way. So very uncanny. And so let's move on to something even not as grim.
Yeah.
Let's talk about a notification to the human resource about resigning from a job. Okay, so when we talk about a job, anything of that nature, we also have to pull in like the 3 houses, 2nd, 6th, and 10th, because it's all about vocational houses. Just to let the audience know. And for this, I'm actually pretty glad that the Resignation chart on the right, the angles are actually correct, because I actually asked my longtime client for email timestamp of when he actually sent the email to HR to say I quit. Mm-hmm. So the angles are accurate. And you can see from the transit chart, Chiron is actually rising, conjunct the ascendant. So there's almost like a deep pain or woundedness surrounding that of not being able to be himself if in regards to this job. And it's ruled by Mars. And Mars has just separated from Uranus as well. And Mars-Uranus is to really like, screw all this, I'm leaving. So you can really see this Resignation chart is quite symbolic of the event that actually happened. So now let's move on to the bi-wheel. And in this case, the bi-wheel, the inner bi-wheel is the native's birth chart, and the outer wheel is the transit chart. So as I mentioned earlier, the macro picture here would be that transit Chiron and ascendant conjunction in Aries, which is right here in his natal second house. It falls into that. And it conjuncts pretty closely to his natal part of spirit. And part of spirit is an Arabic point that talks about career or work-related issues for this matter. And is that circle with the S in it is part of spirit, the Arabic part. And when the ascendant and Chiron in the transit chart conjuncts his natal part of spirit, this actually tells me that there's a lot of pains, hurts, wounds around him. And that in that transit chart, the ascendant Chiron conjunction happens in Aries. So we got to look at the ruler Mars. And Mars, as I mentioned earlier, is in a fixed sign Taurus that just separated from Uranus. So I actually asked him, why did you actually decide to suddenly send HR and say, I'm done, I quit? And he actually said that he feels underpaid and under-recognized at work. And with that, he feels that his work is also very challenging, by the way. And there's also a lot of buried anger and resentment involved as well regarding that. So that forms like the picture, what's going on. And the second thing that paints the macro picture is that transit Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So it just happened in the beginning of this year. And at that moment, this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is transiting his natal 12th house of losses. And it's also on a certain level endings. And it's squaring his natal 4th and 9th house ruler Venus. So it's squaring with this pink color bubbles. And if I look at his natal chart, he actually has what I call a T-square to begin with, which is located in his natal house 3rd, 6th, and 9th. And then this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in his natal 12th house just completes the last corner, which makes it form a grand square, a fixed grand square, by the way. So it's a very powerful chart configuration. It's only hard aspects that's dealing with squares and oppositions. When we talk about a grand square, in this case, and not to mention that the Mars-Uranus separating conjunction activates his natal Chiron as well. So he's feeling so pissed. He doesn't feel valued. That's going through his mind, 3rd house. And all this grand square energy from the transit chart completing his natal chart configuration, which is a T-square in his natal chart, he finally got the guts because it's a fixed sign. Fixed sign means that you're perpetually hitting the wall. And as we know, fixed signs are more on the stubborn side, and they need to really consistently hit the wall to really wake up in order to move. And this really made him like, you know what? Maybe it's time for me to screw all of this and begin a new chapter, because all this, all the houses I mentioned are in the cadent houses 3rd, 6th, 9th, and 12th, which is the mutable houses. And so it's about letting go of something to start something new before you move into the cardinal 1st, 4th, 7th, 10th houses. So he decided to let things go, so to speak. And the last one that I spotted is that transit K2 or South Node, which is bang on his natal Neptune. And also, I want to mention that he's also going through a midlife crisis where there's a natal Neptune to transit Neptune square in the sky. And in the sky, also, there's a Neptune is squaring the nodes in the sky at the point whereby he's headed. When I think about a transit Neptune and nodal square in the sky, and something like an epiphany actually occurs. And this energy activated his natal Neptune, which co-rule his 2nd house of income. And Neptune is in the 10th house of career. So he knows what he's signing up for. He's just going to give up his career, potentially sabotaging his income, money in his bank, surrendering to that process, which is Neptune.
And the is like apathy. I don't care anymore.
And it's almost like, so what if I lose this job? This job, what it has provided or afforded me, 2nd house, is all an illusion. Neptune. And true enough, after he resigned from this job, I think he got one more job in a similar field, and then he's just done. He's got a total career change in front of him. So you can see how this particular midlife transit that's activated also with the notes coming in really made him like turn his life around. Yeah, as well. And let's look at anything from transit Sun to Mars, and also the transit angles of the notification of Resignation chart. And transit Sun is part of the Aquarian stellium that's in his natal 12th house, going through that. And the Sun rules Leo. Now let's look at what Leo is all about in his natal chart. There's Mars in Leo in his 6th house of work. And Sun as well is responsible to form that grand square in the sky, interacting with his natal chart. So, and Mars there is to really like to cut away from a work environment that actually happened to him. And by the way, he actually quit on a close to exact full moon in the sky, because the Sun is at 9 degrees of Aquarius. Moon in the sky is at 13 of Leo. So he actually quit on a full moon. And natally, he's got a balsamic moon or a dark moon phase. If I actually merge these two lunar phases, the transit full moon in the sky really talks about things that's really illuminated. You can't really hide from it anymore. It's so obvious in your face. And his natal balsamic moon is to let go and let God. So if I were to combine the meaning, he decided to let it go. And that's it.
Do you have Virgo people asking in the chat room? Do you have Virgo in you because you're so analytical?
I'm Virgo rising. I thought you should.
Okay, because noticing all the details. because like you're amazing, like a genius in that. Because I'm Aries, I want to rush, and I would just look at one thing. South Node transiting planet in the 10th house. Bam, he's letting go of a career. Or
Yeah, yeah, right,
so
right.
many planets
But
in the
then
12th.
there's like maybe
Or
Virgo
Saturn
like to,
square Venus. He's dissatisfied with money. Bam, he
yeah.
doesn't appreciate it.
But then
So that
there's like nuances to it, which I find like it really adds into the richness of the story.
I
And
love that. I wouldn't have the capacity to do it, but it's fascinating that you can notice all those things.
and transit moon is in his natal sixth house. And moon rules Cancer, and Cancer, it is in his sixth house. So there's like the double sixth house activation as well. And the transit sun is in his 12th house. So 6 and 12 is really like letting go of work or loss of a job, moving away from a work environment. All these things just keep drilling in. And I'm like, this is something. Yeah, I've actually typed all this things so people can go back and refer to it. You just have to blow your screen a bit bigger for that. So now let's move on to the second part of this example, which is the end of his clearance date. This came from the same person, so the natal chart is the same. The clearance chart on the right is the angles of the clearance chart are actually accurate because I actually asked him, it's a guy, to actually email the HR after he left the company because he need to scan to get out of the company. That's his last moment whereby adios, I'm done. Off I go, a free man from this shitty job. And the HR actually replied to him, surprisingly, with his official clock out time. So the angles of this clearance chart is accurate, as far as I know, down to the minute. And so you can see on the right side of the chart, we have a Taurus rising, and then you got Mars, the planet of cutting, to cut and be free. And it's in the sign of Taurus, which is Venus root. And Venus, the ruler of Mars in the clearance chart, is in the sign of Aquarius, which is to be free. I find it so symbolic that I was like just taken aback, like some things are just meant to be, and it's at 22 degrees as well, Aquarius. To let things die and be done with it and go. And also on top of that, there's also Jupiter in Aquarius. Jupiter is also to be free. Aquarius is to be free, and it's in the 10th house, to be free from something that he's been doing for quite some time for career's sake. Yeah. Sometimes I'm still very surprised by the symbolic astrological meanings that jump out at me when I look at charts, even to today, after some years of practicing. So now let's move on to the bi-wheel and what's actually activating the natal chart. But for this, I just want to tell the audience that because I couldn't see the impact if I put the natal chart on the inside. So for this example, I actually put the clearance chart on the inside. And I put his natal chart on the outside for more clarity of what are the influences in this case. So now let's look at the macro circumstantial indicators. And the first thing that jumped out at me is transit K2. That's called transit K2, which is over here. Sorry. Yeah. Transit K2 over here is still conjuncting his natal Neptune. That one we've covered in the last example because he did his clearance pretty fast. He can't wait to get out. And that's actually shown by all the Aquarian energy in the 10th house of the clearance chart. So the next part will be transit Neptune is actually opposing actually, this is a typo. It's actually squaring. So transit Neptune is squaring Saturn in his natal chart. And natal Saturn, because he's an Aquarius rising, it rules his first house and 12th house. So this is a minor correction. This is a square, as you guys know. And these are the things that I basically picked up, is mostly about transit South Node and transit Neptune that's going on, because he's already notified HR regarding his resignation. This is like the final straw to just go in, do the paperwork, and just get the heck out of there. So now let's look at the triggers from transit Sun to Mars, and also the transit angles of the clearance chart to his natal that make this event occur concretely in his life. And transit Mercury. Transit Mercury, so which is here, is angular. It's very close to the 10th house cusp in the clearance chart. It actually rules the 2nd house and the 5th house over here. And it's opposing his natal 6th house Mars. So this actually tells me that he needs to follow his heart, because his natal Mars is in Leo, which is the brave heart in all of us, to make that public decision to change his income stream via leaving his current work environment, which is the opposition to Mercury angular in the clearance chart. Also, the transit 7th and 12th house ruler, both are co-ruled by Mars in the sky, located in the 1st house of the clearance chart, conjuncts the 3rd house ruler, Moon, in the clearance chart as well, both in the 1st. And these two are meeting up with his natal 4th house cusp, which is endings and beginnings of some sorts. So if I combine all the house rulerships within the clearance chart and match the meanings with the 4th house cusp in his natal chart, it literally means that he needs to be brave to leave this place, and he did. So this is here. Even though he has contributed a lot for his work, he needs to leave that all behind and move on. And the last one will be transit Venus in the sky, which is in the 10th house. Is ruling the ascendant in the clearance chart and the 6th house in the clearance chart. And this is very close to conjunct his natal ascendant, which is his body. So since we're talking about Aquarius, it's about that self-initiated liberation, that natal ascendant in Aquarius being activated by that Venus in the clearance chart, which rules the ascendant and 6th house to leave his job, whatever that the job has offered in terms of routines, duties, and the work environment is pretty shitty according to him as well. He decided to initiate himself to leave and free himself, Aquarius, from that place. And so let's move on to the transit angles, what is actually activating in his natal chart. So transit, I had a good laugh actually pertaining to this, because transit 7th house cusp of the clearance chart actually conjuncts his natal ascendant co-ruler because he's ascendant rising, so Uranus co-rule his ascendant, and is located in his natal chart in the ninth. So his ninth house is really about searching life's meaning, purpose, and direction. So one of the motivations when I talk to him is that, are you searching for that deeper meaning in life and purpose and direction? That's why you decided to peace out. And he said that's exactly how he felt leading up to the day where he sent HR that resignation notice. And last but not least, the transit fourth house cusp, like I mentioned earlier, conjuncts his natal Mars that's located in his sixth house of work. And so he's cutting away from that work to follow his heart, Leo. He's got to end this in order to follow his heart. So for my very last example, I shall be talking about the one who shot Versace. Because this case, I think it was on FX channel. This pseudo docu series, I suppose is called, that's named like The Assassination of Gianni Versace. I think it was like some years back, and it was fascinating. And I remember watching the news as a young kid on telly when he passed as well. And the guy who's responsible for his death is this Eurasian guy, half white, half Filipino, called Andrew Cunanan. And I have pulled up his natal chart on the left and the suicide chart on the right. And this suicide chart, I need to mention, I set the suicide chart for noon because I don't have a reliable birth time. So I just used the date that's on the news and just set it as 12 p.m. for that location, which is Miami, Florida. Before I actually go more in depth into what actually the suicide situations, what are the indicators surrounding that, I'll just like to briefly talk about his natal chart, because the natal chart needs to have somehow predisposition for someone to do exactly that. It's almost like nature, the nature part of things. Part is also nurture, but also you need to be presented by a series of circumstances and the road that you choose to walk down in order to let life guide you down that path, if you know what I mean. So now let's look at his natal chart. He's got a natal Saturn retrograde conjunct Moon, which rules in his natal chart the 4th and 10th house cusp, the parental axis. So this actually tells me that, and these two planets are rising in his chart in the first house, in the sign of storage, which is Taurus. So what this tells me is that, or it indicates that there's an early life starvation of feeling and emotional nurturing coming from both parents because of the rising planets ruling the parental axis, respectively. And Saturn retrograde also indicate that the father figure's way of teaching Andrew when he's growing up is ineffective, or that the father is absent in his upbringing altogether, which is the actual case for him, by the way. And last but not least, when Saturn retrograde is rising natally, his own internal authority can be inflated. That means indirectly he thinks he's the shit. In other words, it can be that as well. And both Saturn and Moon that's rising in his first house in the natal chart is ruled by Venus in the 4th house. So what this tells me is that there's already a emotional starvation and feelings of neglect. He may also face like events of disapproval in his life, and a real lack in return of his love and feelings from another, which is Venus in Leo in the 4th house. When it's so underneath the chart Venus, it may not be seen because it's so deep in his chart. It's hard to project it out because Venus is a projective energy. That's why it rules Libra. And Venus is actually squaring Sun and Saturn, so that coldness, and you can't get reciprocal. This actually pains to me that, or it suggests that he's actually got a very sad and lonely background or upbringing, with likely no family support system. That's the nature part that's represented by his natal chart, and may have gone through through the family lineage, which is Venus in the 4th house. What I want to bring attention to regarding his chart is that Mars, natally in his 8th house, squaring Pluto in the 6th house. Both are dark or shadowed houses. Houses 2nd, 6th, 8th, and 12th are shadow or dark houses to start with. And Pluto actually let me focus on Mars in this case, because Mars actually first of all represents anger. So this tells me that his fury and rage in yearning for a supportive background may become the fabric of his sexual and emotional life, which is Pluto over here. Yeah, I think that's what I want to mention regarding his natal chart. So there's already like a predisposition of what he can be if he go down that path. And the nurture part are the circumstances that actually enable him to go down that path, for that matter. So let's look at the bi-wheel. I've put the natal in the inner wheel, and the ending and death chart, which is a suicide chart in this case, in the outer wheel. And transit notes really jumped out at me because he died at age 27 to 29, in which he's undergoing a reverse nodal conjunction, which usually occurs at age 27. And we have known this thing called the 27 Club. And there's countless examples of famous artists, musicians who died at that age. For example, Jimi Hendrix, Amy Winehouse, Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain, Jim Morrison, just to name a few. When they pass the event chart and the natal chart, there's a reverse nodal conjunction. When I actually see a reverse nodal conjunction, this can really be telling me that there's external situations closing in on that person to cause one's eventual demise or leaving one's body by ending it. And in his case, it's via suicide. And the transit notes also highlight his natal 7th and 12th house co-rulers, which are Mars and Pluto, like what I mentioned earlier, that's in square. It's somehow binded into that transit transit notes in the sky. And by the way, he's got a natal Pluto and South Node conjunction. So that's already activating his predisposition for some kind of danger or some kind of malicious intent, or maybe some levels of deceit that's going on, because he did live a part of his life pretending something that he's not. That can be very Plutonian, very deceitful. So you can see the transit South Node is activating his natal Mars and Pluto square that's tied into his natal nodes as well. So the apex here is Mars in the 8th. And this may be that the soul leaves the body, which is the nodal axis meaning, via Martian waves, which is a gunshot, some sharp object, or pulling that trigger, in which that's what he did. And transit Uranus in the sky is in his natal 10th house and is squaring his ascendant and descendant axis. And ascendant is the physical body. 7th house is where the sun's rays go to die. And he also squares his Saturn and also Moon rising in his natal chart, which rules his 4th and 10th house axis. So you can see all the angular house by rulership or by aspect is activated via that transit Uranus. So this tells me that he'll be going off with a bang, which is like Uranian energy. And last but not least, there's a transit Venus-Pluto square in the sky. And transit Venus of this square is connected to his natal part of fortune. Where is transit Venus? Yeah. So this is really talking about him tying his personal journey, which is part of fortune, into a crime spree of passion. Because when we talk about Venus-Pluto square, definitely something passionate comes up, and then the Pluto brings something that's more malicious and more deadly. When I think of Venus-Pluto square, I think of like Fatal Attraction, that movie back in the 80s. There's that kind of feeling for him. So it's very much that, and triggers from transit Sun to Mars. Transit Moon in the sky is connected to that transit K2 or South Node. And natally, he's got Cancer IC as well. So Moon rules Cancer, and then the ruler within his natal chart, which is the Moon, is rising in his chart, conjunct the malefic Saturn. So very much, as I mentioned here, is tying his physical body, first house, into the houses of endings. If you were to dissect closely what this trigger from the transit Moon is about. And transit Mercury in the sky, which is over here in Leo, late Leo, is applying to square his natal 12th and 7th house ruler. This is inaccurate, by the way. Sorry for that. 12th and 7th house ruler for... Sorry, it is actually correct. But it's not Neptune, if I recall. Is it? Yes, it is. Sorry. Sorry, I'm getting a bit like tired here. So transit Mercury is squaring his natal Neptune in the 7th house. And Neptune co-ruled the 12th house. So this square, it connects the 5th, 7th, and 12th together. So fifth, anything that's passionate. Seventh house really is about the dissolution of something via a deadly scenario. And 12th house is losses. So Mercury is the one triggering it, and Mercury rules decisions. So there can be a sense of mental, Mercury, despair, or paranoia, which is Neptune over here. Maybe there's also a sense of regret as well. Or maybe there's something unclear. His mind is unclear where he pulled the trigger on himself. Or he may be flashing back into the past of what it could have been. There's something Neptunian here as well. And I shall leave the last part to, there's more, but I think I just want to finish this up. Anyway, you can rewatch it in the replay itself. Regarding this last point over here. So I just want to change the focus into using astrocartography, in which is what I use for relocation astrology, applying this to his path of destruction and also eventual death. I've found an article that details his path of destruction and eventual death over here. And the biggest screen here in the background is the astrocartography map in which I use from Solar Fire to do my clients' relocation chart. And all those that I've highlighted in bright pink, those are the cities that he committed crime in. Realize that all or nearly all these places fall into his Mars descendant line. Mars is to kill. Descendant is to kill another descendant.
Oh, wow. Fascinating.
And it all falls very close, 3 out of 4 places. Only one place, which is Philadelphia, is at the Sun and IC line. So the Sun is relocated to the 4th house when he's at Philadelphia. And is perhaps to lie low and recharge before continuing on his spree, crime of passion. So you can see how all these things is so uncanny.
Crazy, yeah.
And the very last slide I have is that his very last victim was Gianni Versace. And Gianni Versace actually lives in Miami, Florida, but he's actually born in Italy. So I actually relocated this Andrew Cunanan's chart to the birthplace of Gianni Versace in Italy. And something very interesting came up. So Gianni Versace is actually born in this city in Italy, very close to Sicily, actually. And when I relocate Andrew's chart to Gianni Versace's birthplace, the Sun ascendant line is cutting very close to that location. And a sub-energy line, which is what I call a parent line, Mars and Pluto is also intersecting with that chart, with that line, with the ascendant Sun line. The Mars and Pluto parent line actually intersects it. So it's right here. And natally, Andrew Cunanan has got a Mars-Pluto square. And Mars is in his Placidus 8th house. It's a shadowed house, it's a dark house. And it also can be a house of destruction as well. And his Sagittarius, his Mars is in a sign of Sagittarius, which can rule foreigners because he's gay. So Jupiter can also be his lovers as well. And also Sagittarius can mean I've actually talked with this I've actually talked about this with Josie. Sagittarius or Jupiter can also mean someone's sugar daddy as well. So he's got all this in his life as themes leading up to his death in his late 20s. What I really want to point out is that the Sun ascendant line, which means that he's very prominent or infamous. When someone's Sun conjunct ascendant, someone is bound to be very noticeable. Someone can be very famous.
So he became very famous in Italy when he killed Versace.
So Sun and ascendant brings him into infamy, almost, his legacy, almost. And his legacy is tied to an assassination, which is Mars and Pluto, of someone who's born here, which is Versace. So he'll be forever be linked or tied to this fashion designer's demise. And when I think about Mars and Pluto, since he's got the natal square that's connected to his nodal axis as well, this tells me that probably it's revenge related, and it leads to his assassination plan, very much that. So I wonder if he actually self-identified this mission as his ultimate purpose, which is Sun and ascendant line crossing. Food for thought, actually.
What a shitty ultimate life purpose it is.
But you know what? Each one of us serve a purpose. It's not for me to really judge. But the thing is that I really find it really interesting that, for revenge and eternal fame, maybe it's just that he decided to gun down Versace.
Wow.
Because some things are just, you can't make this up.
Thank you for giving us so much of your time. And this fascinating, it's a whole lesson in astrology.
Yeah, I mean, that's the end. So
thank you for preparing this. It was fascinating. And if anyone would like to contact Donny, I'll put a link underneath in the description to his services. He, as you can see, he's very in-depth, very meticulous. And he's offering answer to one question for a week or two at a discounted price. So happy Halloween, everyone. I hope all the endings and murders you'll see will be on TV only, nothing like that around you. And looking forward to speak with you again soon, Donny, when our astrology marathon starts in a month from now.
Oh, by the way, to the audience, I'm not doing only one video, I'm doing two. So
yes.
You get a bonus.
He's Astro Genius. We gave him 2 videos for 2022. Thank you, Donny. Have a great day.
All right, ciao.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.